Good morning, everybody.
Morning, Eric.
Good morning, Anne.
Hey, Anne, have you heard from Susan and Tweed and, oh, there's Susan, okay. I just wanna make sure that we have. One. There's Susan and Tweed, I think our staff should be. There's Katie. And we just need Aaron to make sure we have everybody. And there's Aaron. Okay, let's wait one more minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. We don't have Bill or Carl on, but we can still go ahead and move forward. I do want to remind everybody that this is being recorded, of course, and will be uploaded today or tomorrow.
Sounds good.
I don't see any guests joining us, so I think it's just us. Okay, Eric, why don't we go ahead and get started? Everybody's in attendance. It looks like Anne, Susan and Tweed, Aaron, Katie, Eric, and myself. The purpose of the meeting this morning is for Eric to do an overview of the presentation that he's planning to give to council next week. For you to look at and to provide feedback on. And then we'll move forward. So with Eric, I'll just turn it over to you if that's okay.
That sounds great. Thanks, Denise. And I guess just to reiterate what Denise was just saying is the goal of this meeting is to provide the task force with an update and get feedback on the path that we've been heading down prior to submitting this for a work session with City Council, again with the goal of showing them the current project floodplain issues and how we're proposing and moving forward so far in solving those issues. And so during this presentation, we're going to kind of go through what the floodplain requirements are at a high level, what triggers us needing to comply with them, and the variance that's been granted and what the ramifications or implications of that are, as well as a few different solutions for solving this issue. So feel free to jump in with questions at any time. There's going to be a lot of kind of more detailed code, building code talked about during this presentation, and I'm not going to cover every bit of building code, but just kind of the high level items that try to tell the story of the code requirements that we're trying to solve here. So the first thing to go through is whenever you're working in a floodplain, I think that's used as a general term. Another term that's tied to floodplain in the building code is the flood hazard zone. And so there's two primary codes that oversee the building of a new and existing building from a design standpoint. It's the International Building Code and the International Existing Building Code. There's other codes such as mechanical codes and plumbing codes and electrical codes that also play a large role in the design of buildings, but these two are the ones that are setting up a lot of the floodplain requirements that we're having to or would have to follow for the dance hall restoration and the new kind of supporting structure added on to the dance hall. And so hopefully you can see my mouse now. The first thing to talk about with where the flood hazard codes apply is within the International Building Code. And I'm listing out sections here to kind of provide a roadmap. Again, we don't need to know every little piece of the code, but just kind of, again, outlining why a project gets more constraints put on it when it's in a flood zone. And so section 1612 of the International Building Code talks about flood loading. And, specifically, it states that within flood hazard zones, which we're in, all new construction of buildings, structures, and portions of buildings and structures, including substantial improvement and restoration, so we're doing both those things on this site, shall be designed and constructed to resist the effects of flood hazards and flood loads. And so at a high level, what this is basically saying is any new building being constructed within a flood zone or existing building being substantially improved within a flood zone has to be structurally designed or structurally reinforced to resist the flood loads that will be put upon that structure. So, that's kind of like the starting point here. Now, in the International Existing Building Code, there's additional pieces of information that say when you do or don't have to comply with flood codes. But again, we're just kind of setting up the roadmap here of what or how these codes are kind of talking to each other. So section 104 in the International Existing Building Code states that if the building official declares the dance hall, well, not the dance hall in the code, but I added that, the rehabilitation constitutes a substantial improvement or repair, that you would be required to comply with flood hazard items. And just from a code definition, substantial improvement, I believe it's whenever you spend 50% of the building's cost on improving the building, which, kind of given the current project's budget would be in line with a substantial improvement. Within the International Existing Building Code, it also states that wherever there are practical difficulties involved in carrying out the provisions of this code, the code official shall have the authority to grant modifications, provided that they first find that the special individual reason makes the strict letter of the code impractical. So this is basically saying that the code official is able to modify the requirements being put upon a structure if upon their review they feel like there's an undue hardship being put upon the property. But the important aspect of this is that they could do so as long as the modification does not lessen health, accessibility, life and fire safety, or structural requirements of that structure. So this is going to be important when we talk about the variance that was granted for the site. But what this is saying is, again, that the code official, Pikes Peak Regional Building Department, is allowed to provide relief to requirements of the code as long as we're not lessening the safety of the building as it currently exists. From its existing condition to today. Section 507.3 is important for us because it's in relationship to historic buildings. Something that might have already been brought up to you all in the past, but it's basically stating that historic buildings that meet the below criteria or any of the below criteria don't need to be brought into compliance with that section in the International Building Code 1612, which is this top one here in terms of being constructed to resist flood loading. And the one that applies to us specifically is that the structure could be designated as historic under a state or local historic preservation program that is approved by the Department of Interior. So this is a designated historic structure or in a historic district. So this exception is again stating that the historic building only would not need to comply with this section 1612. And then the last section that I wanted to bring up is section 1204 or 1201.4, which is in flood hazard areas. If all proposed work, including repairs, work required because of the change of occupancy and alteration constitutes a substantial improvement, which our project would, then the existing building shall comply with section 1612 of the International Building Code. And then if a historic building will continue to be a historic building after the proposed work is completed, then the proposed work is not considered a substantial improvement. So this is, again, giving more support to the historic structure, not necessarily being required to comply with anything that a substantial improvement would trigger, which is, again, just reinforcing that we wouldn't technically not be required to meet the flood loading criteria. However, we end up getting into this kind of endless loop where the building official can't provide us an exception from not providing a safe building for its occupants. And I'm sure there's plenty of questions. I'll keep moving along unless something pops to anyone's mind, but we can always jump back. And so, those are just a few code sections as to why this floodplain creates some tricky situations for us to solve. They're all solvable. It's just we need to have a strategy in place to work around those requirements, such as the structural reinforcing to meet the flood loading, for example. So what are we required to do? Well, we are required to promote public health, safety, and general welfare. Structural and life safety improvements will also be required to resolve flood forces. So this is, I'm just saying that no matter what the code requires or what we're exempt from, we still must design and develop this project up to the standard of care, which requires us prioritizing public health, safety, and welfare. So we wouldn't move the project forward in any way that would jeopardize people's safety. And the building code, they have objectives that they state as to why these codes are in effect. And I guess it's for the flooding, designing the floodway specifically, but it's to protect human life, to minimize the expenditure of public money for flood control projects, meaning they don't want to put an undue hardship on a city or the owner if a lesser solution can be implemented to resolve the floodplain issues. But they're also trying to minimize the need for rescue and relief efforts that would be associated with the flooding in the event that they would occur. They want to minimize prolonged business interruption, making sure that the site is resilient to flooding, and so we can get back into operation quickly. The code's striving to minimize the damage that a facility and utility would undergo in the event of a flood. And in order to help maintain a stable tax base and provide for the sound use and development of flood-prone areas. So the idea being that they don't want to create land that has to sit undeveloped in perpetuity because just because it's in a floodplain. They understand that some areas need to use that land and that it's important for the city or area to acquire tax revenue from the development of that property. And then contribute to improve construction techniques in the floodplain and ensure that potential owners and occupants are notified that property is within the flood hazard areas. And this is just making sure that the code is creating the incentive to construct flood resistant structures that we know are within the floodplain, making sure again that the public safety is at the forefront. So again, all this distilling down into we have to create a project that protects public health, safety, and general welfare. And so the variance that was already granted for the site states that the requested variance from the new construction and substantial improvement requirements set forth in RBC 313.19.2 non-residential construction is hereby granted. So the requested variance from the requirements set forth in this section, which I've listed below here, has been granted, meaning according to the variance, the project would not have to technically comply with these requirements, which is significant in the letter of the variance, because according to the section, and I know this is really in the nitty-gritty here, but it's important to have a general idea of what some of these requirements would or wouldn't be for a new building or renovation within the area, to kind of explain why we've head down the path of what the solution or our proposed solution is. But new construction and substantial improvement of any commercial, industrial, or other non-residential structure shall either have the lowest floor, including the basement, together with attendant utility and sanitary facilities, elevated to 1 foot or more above the level of base flood elevation. And what that's saying is that new construction or renovation must have its lowest level 1 foot above the floodplain. And where that becomes applicable to our project is that our
Okay, I think I'm in.
It sounds like, okay.
Thank you.
We'll note that Bill joined at 9:16.
Yeah. The link was no good, so I called City Hall.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us, Bill. I'm glad you were able to get on.
Thank you.
So again, what this is kind of the basis of the floodplain issue, in that our finished floor is below the 100-year floodplain. It is not the required 1 foot or more above the level of flood. So the variance the goal of the variance was to get approval to be to not need to follow that requirement. But also within this section are requirements for the building to be dry flood proofed, meaning that flood waters would not infiltrate the structure and damage the interior materials. And then that the structure would need to be impermeable to the passage of water, meaning you're completely keeping water out of your structure in the event of a flood. The structural components would have to be capable of resisting the flood loading and the effects of buoyancy, meaning the building is going to want to pop out of the ground when it's surrounded by floodwaters. So it need to be anchored down more substantially. The structure would have to be certified by a registered design professional, verifying that the standards of this subsection are satisfied. So just meaning that you would have a structural engineer and an architect working on the project. Section 4 is not applicable to our project because it's not a critical facility. And again, Section 5 is kind of the part of the whole initial section of this code here, which states that you shall have the lowest finished floor elevated 2 feet above the flood level, and shall have continuous non-inundated access, ingress, or ingress or egress for evacuation emergency services during a 100-year flood event. So the variance that was granted provides relief from all of these requirements in theory. So what is important to note is that there's many other sections with additional flood requirements, which the variance did not grant exception from. So the variance is not a blanket. You do not need to meet any flood requirements. It's purely giving us exception to these items. But for example, we're still required to make sure that we are not reducing or that we're creating a safe, structurally reinforced building that could resist the flood loading from a life safety standpoint. There's still going to be plumbing requirements in terms of backflow preventers in the case of a flood, and there's mechanical requirements in terms of what is not allowed to be put on the site versus what has to be elevated above the building, to keep equipment outside of the flood level. So in terms of capturing the full extent of what the flood code requirements are, it'd be a much longer discussion with everybody here, but I just want to emphasize that the variance does not grant us exception from life safety or other code items for designing the floodway. And so, the preferred path we've been heading down has a primary goal of ensuring safety for everybody. It's at the forefront of the design process here is, in the event of a flood, because we know it's in the floodplain, we have to plan for it to be so. We want to make sure that everyone is safe first and foremost. And so we've been exploring with the civil engineer, the ideal solution, which would be the elimination of the 100-year floodplain from the project site, so that it would give us, the maximum amount of flexibility on how the project can move forward. And we're not going to be tied to these, various floodplain requirement design constructions. And so by eliminating the 100-year flood requirements, it would also eliminate the life safety requirements from the historic and the new building. It would also eliminate the flood damage risk to every car parked on the site, the site infrastructure, all the landscaping. In the event of a flood, soils would be washed away, site furnishings would be destroyed, and most importantly, eliminating the 100-year flood from the site means that all pedestrians on the site would not be in danger from the flood. Eliminating the 100-year flood from the site would also eliminate the need for flood insurance, which is a significant cost that will add up over time pretty quickly. I believe initial cost for flood insurance for similar properties was between $80,000 and $100,000 a year, with a 25% annual increase. So, this expense has caused the city to self-insure similar properties to avoid this expenditure. But again, within 10 years, you could accrue over $1 million in insurance costs. So it seems pretty responsible to spend that money on a solution opposed to insurance. And the goal of any project is to make sure we're spending money in ways that users can experience the money and the improvements, such as being able to spend money on integrating our floodplain solution with the Creek Walk master plan, opposed to spending money on flood proofing that's buried within a wall assembly, for example. So again, I guess just to summarize, the preferred path that we've been moving forward with to date is to completely eliminate the 100-year floodplain from our project site and eliminate the floodplain requirements that would be imposed on our site because of being within it. And so I'm going to go through these flood mitigation options quickly because they'll be following diagrams. We'll talk about it in more detail. But option one is for us to widen the floodway, as we've talked about during our last meeting of encroaching on the Chase Bank site with a retaining wall to allow the floodway to be widened and allow the floodwaters to pass through the site without spilling onto our site. Option two is to install a culvert below the Chase Bank site to allow for, again, the floodwaters to move around the pinch point that the Chase Bank site is creating. And again, prevent the floodwaters from backing up and flowing onto our site. And option three is to install a culvert again, but this time install the culvert on our site, moving around the new proposed structure and back out. And again, you'll see these in more detail in the next slides. So option one is the expansion of the retaining wall on the Chase Bank side. And this is just a diagram. We've since gotten more accurate designed numbers and widths of what this widening would be. So it doesn't graphically depict exactly what we're proposing, but it does depict the general idea. And so what we would be looking at doing for option one is carving out part of the Chase Bank site. Because what's happening currently is the existing retaining wall is creating a pinch point. The existing retaining wall heads right around here. And as you can see, you go from a wider section of floodway into a narrower section that restricts the flow of an oncoming flood. That restriction causes the water to back up, and then that's what causes it to spill over onto our site. And so, tied to the suggestion from our last task force meeting and the fact that the city owns the Chase Bank site, we have a unique opportunity to carve into the Chase Bank site to widen the floodway, install a new retaining wall, and allow those floodwaters to bypass our site, not back up, and therefore remove our site from the 100-year floodplain. Other potential improvements, because we're still at a fairly high level as to this solution, is on the north shore, or the north shore of the Fountain Creek. We are going to be looking at ways to integrate pedestrian access to the creek level. So this money ideally can be integrated with the overall Creek Walk master plan, and we can tie what improvements we make to this north side into, how does that future infrastructure tie in to the site, and how can we get more pedestrians down to the creek level, even from an accessibility standpoint, making sure that we can integrate ramps that also get users down to the creek level. So the opportunity to provide a new recreational opportunity, or a new recreational use for everybody is pretty exciting to us. The next option is the culvert through the Chase Bank site. Now, the culvert, well, let me back up for a quick second. The hurdle for option one is figuring out how do we maintain vehicular circulation around the Chase Bank site and maintain the drive-through functionality. And that's where we're in that next level of detail currently, working through how much of a drive lane can we salvage here. And we feel confident that we'll be able to maintain a one-way drive lane, which is what it is currently, but we'll likely have to compress it a little bit more to make sure we get rid of that flow restriction. When we were working through that drive lane issue, another thought that or strategy that came through of, you know, what if we wanted to leave the existing retaining wall alone and just divert the flow through a culvert. And so this is just a diagram. We aren't saying that the culvert would actually go under the Chase building, but it's just diagramming out that we would be able to capture the flows heading down Fountain Creek and have, you can think of it as a large storm drain that would then take those additional flows that would have otherwise backed up onto our site and divert them through a culvert that's underground, and then redistribute them once we're past this pinch point. And again, this kind of shows the pinch point a little bit better, how you have the wider floodway and then it gets constricted at our project. And then the third option is if we wanted to avoid touching the Chase Bank site entirely, or if the city didn't own the Chase Bank site, for example, or sold it in the future, that culvert could then be ran around our project site or our building in a way that it keeps the culvert entirely on our property. And so I guess just real quick, before I move past these diagrams, are there any questions about any of these three options?
Question.
Yes.
It appears to me to be pretty obvious that removing the pinch point on the south end of Hiawatha Gardens, right in the area where the flow, it looks like it comes very close to the building. That to me strikes me as a fairly easy, straightforward way of addressing this issue. It may take some parking spaces away and doesn't allow the drive-through capability that the Chase Bank had, but I think it would reduce, and I think you've demonstrated that might be the cheapest way to go.
Yeah, this is Bill, right?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And you're spot on. This is the most economical of the three options. So this would be what we would recommend we move forward with and continue to refine. And your concern about the drive lane here, I'm going to pull up a map here real quick just to better articulate what we're talking about. So what Bill's talking about, and I'm sure most of us are familiar with, is the current Chase Bank site has a drive-through located under this roof portion, which then continues up to the north side of the building and then out. This is a one-way drive aisle, and I think it's around 15 feet wide currently, I believe. But that number needs to be confirmed. What we're working with civil is what is the minimum one-way drive aisle width that would allow, you know, your larger typical vehicle going through a drive-through to still make this turn while maximizing the amount of width that we have. You know, is it 9 feet wide? Do we need to do some type of cutout in the retaining wall just to allow vehicles to get around here? There's a level of detail that, you know, we're going to need to explore, but we feel pretty confident in being able to find a solution that allows this to remain a one-way drive aisle.
Okay.
So Eric, one
Yes.
quick question. I assume for sure option one, maybe 2 and 3 as well, require some kind of change in the floodplain, like a letter of map revision or something like that. Is that correct?
So it would be changing the extents of the floodplain, and I would defer to the exact language to our civil engineer, who we don't have with us right now. But yeah, my understanding is that there would be a revision that we'd have to be submitted.
Right. And my or at least my experience is those can be really lengthy discussions.
Potentially, I think the purpose of our initial research here is to, one, find a design solution that, we all feel is the best way for this project to move forward. And then, once that's deemed feasible, civil would have to go through the process, of remapping the floodplain. But
Right.
and to your point, I'm not imagining this is a very like quick, easy process, but the information we're compiling now is what we would then be utilizing to move forward with this from the approval process. So, integrating that into the overall project schedule, I think, is something we'd have to get into more detail with.
Right. No, I agree. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Could we, can you just go through again the importance of the drive-through lane at the bank site?
Sure.
What do you envision for the use of that? Is that for buses? Is that for?
So the Chase Bank drive-through site, from our perspective, the city bought this property and are renovating it for their own new function to not be a bank anymore, right? And there's the potential for this new function to utilize the drive-through. That's been viewed as something that would be liked. They would like to keep that functionality. Is it required?
For what use, Eric?
Uh,
Has that been determined?
So I don't know the specifics of the exact use, but if Denise wants to chime in, feel free.
Sure, I'll chime in. So it's really just so that people don't have to come into the parking office. They could go through the drive-through, pay their tickets or do those type of things. So it's a convenience.
Okay,
And that's kind of one of the reasons that we thought it would be a great item or a great area for us to purchase is for that convenience and keep people from parking, et cetera. So.
okay, thanks.
Yeah, from our perspective, we want to impact that. Keep calling it the Chase Bank site. We want to impact that site as minimal as possible. One, from a cost perspective, it will be less money to do less improvements on that site. The other thing is if the city were to ever want to sell this site back to the public in the future, to become a bank again, who knows? So maintaining that functionality would be, it wouldn't hurt the project, and if we can do so, that'd be great. And in terms of what vehicles can actually use it, buses can't use it currently. It's not sized for a vehicle like that. It's sized for a drive-through ATM or drive-through banking functionality. So for your more pedestrian sized vehicles, cars and trucks.
Thanks.
Sure. And again, if anyone has questions, we can come back to these in the end as you have time to kind of think through it. But so yeah, we came to an agreement in previous meetings that eliminating the 100-year floodplain would just be, it's the best case scenario for this project to move forward with. It eliminates all of the floodplain requirements, all of the costs associated with floodplain improvements and mitigation to the historic structure. It removes the life safety concerns. It removes a lot of the unknowns as well of, you know, even if we structurally reinforce the dance hall, will the soil wash away, exposing the foundation and then cause, you know, foundation failure. So like that, there's layers of investigation that would still need to be undergone to really determine what the true extent of structural reinforcement for the dance hall looks like. And we could potentially just eliminate that, which would be great. And again, there'd be no questions about life safety in terms of flooding, and no questions about damage to property or all the cars on the site due to flooding. If it's determined for whatever reason that the preferred path is not to eliminate the 100-year floodplain, there's still other strategies that we can explore, but because of all the advantages of eliminating the floodplain, that's been our focus to date, just because it has so much potential to it. But, and you've probably heard some of these previously, but if the floodplain's not eliminated, a few options that we can explore are locating the new restroom structure outside of the floodplain and turn the dance hall into an open air pavilion. As I mentioned, structural improvements within the floodplain will always be required to make sure we're meeting life safety requirements, but because you eliminate the exterior walls, you eliminate a lot of the flood loading on the structure, which is reduce the overall structural requirements more than likely. We could locate the restroom structure within the floodplain and still turn the dance hall into an open air pavilion. If we were to locate the restroom structure within the floodplain, we would then be required to design the restroom structure to meet all the floodplain requirements. Whereas in the previous option, if we located it outside the floodplain, it could just be a typical structure without any of the floodplain improvements. We could locate the restroom structure within the floodplain and go through the reinforcement of the dance hall as required to maintain it as an enclosed structure. Again, structure will be required to allow for the automatic entry and exit of floodwater in this event, so that the hydrostatic pressure within and outside the building would equalize, so that, you know, the building wouldn't have the buoyancy effect. This is just a strategy for how you can design an existing structure within a floodplain and try to account for the inevitable intake of water. Yeah, the downside of this strategy would be that during any flood event that there will be damage to the building's finishes, which would have to be repaired, which would be an ongoing cost to the project throughout its lifespan. And then, so I guess for this one, we're talking about creating a building that is designed to take on water to survive a flood. Whereas the next option is where we can locate the structure, the restroom structure within the floodplain, and then we would reinforce and dry flood proof the dance hall as required. Dry flood proofing being you designed the exterior of the building to prevent any infiltration of water into the structure, and which is going to be more challenging because you're trying to waterproof an existing building. In addition to you're having to resist the buoyancy that a flood would cause to the existing structure, the desire for the building to pop out of the ground because it's surrounded by water. You know, the best analogy for that is if you fill up a bucket with water and try to push a Tupperware container down and it wants to pop back up, you're resisting those same forces during the event of a flood. And so I guess the last item is it's kind of brought up the potential to start the restroom structure construction prior to any other part of the project moving forward. It's definitely possible. It's just a matter of finding out what the preferred direction is from the city as to how they want to move forward, so that we can then figure out how to phase a restroom structure separate from other potential improvements. And then this is a diagram that's been shared previously. We're just including it for visual reference, as well as just noting that this is information that's been available and accessible. And it's just showing that if this is the historic dance hall, this is the current floodplain elevation, and this gray line here would be the finished floor. And again, it's just showing how the existing building is below the flood elevation. And again, just to hit the bullet points here, we're in the 100-year floodplain. The historic dance hall is exempt from floodplain requirements due to its historic designation, as we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, but it's still not exempt from life safety requirements. And even if we have a variance that seems to provide relief from some of those items, you're not going to find a design team, or you're likely not going to find a design team that's going to design a structure that's not safe to the general public. It just goes against the standard of care for design professionals. The new north building containing the restrooms and other supportive program is not exempt from the floodplain requirements. We would have to build it to comply, to be flood-proofed in some manner or fashion. And city staff are going to be meeting with the floodplain administrator once we figure out what the preferred direction is, just to make sure we're all in agreement. And as we are all doing now, we know that the task force is exploring several options for sites and buildings. And again, this isn't for you all, this is for city council's information more than anything. And then lastly, we will be working through budget numbers for what this retaining wall improvement would be. But we don't have any concrete numbers at this time. So that would be the end of the presentation. I'm planning on adding some additional supporting graphics to maybe better articulate some of the language throughout the presentation. But yeah, I guess I'll just open it up to general questions. What we're really looking for from City Council and from, well, I guess first from the task force is, do you all agree that eliminating the 100-year floodplain is the best path to move this project forward? I guess that's kind of really the main question.
This Bill again. It strikes me that eliminating the floodplain, but have any simulations been done to demonstrate that we can lower the floodplain far enough so that the north building would not have to be in the floodplain and be elevated relative to the dance hall? And the second question really comes down to just a practical question. Wouldn't just building a structurally sound concrete wall vertically right at the edge of the driveway and taking all that accumulated dirt and so forth and so on at the pinch point, would that technique open the floodplain enough so it would drop the floodplain level for the dance hall and the north building at the same time?
So
we can,
if I could jump in real quick, Bill, just to make sure.
Yeah. Go ahead.
talking about going from, we'll call it a base elevation of retaining wall at the wider part and increasing the height of the retaining wall as it hits the pitch point?
Well, the pinch point would be effectively gone away, I would hope. Not that one, the one right opposite the dance hall. Do you,
That's-
do you follow me?
Let,
Right? I can't, I keep trying to use my finger to point, but it doesn't. Do
maybe,
you follow what I'm saying though?
let me grab some drawing tools here and we could work through this. So, okay, you're talking about the pinch point on the south side of the dance hall at the existing retaining wall?
On the south side of the dance hall, on the current Chase Bank, now city property, we widen the floodway through there, put in a vertical or almost vertical concrete structure that is probably the cheapest thing to do, and in effect lower the floodway height for the whole site.
So we're talking about putting a vertical wall in this location.
Yes.
Oh,
And-
yes.
Yes.
That's,
Yeah, that's correct.
that's what our option one is implying, is that
Okay.
we would be,
Okay.
this line is representing a retaining wall,
Mhm.
a vertical wall, and you know, it's just articulating in a way that it's not accounting for our latest information as to how wide it needs to be. It's being shown wider than we want it to be to save this drive lane.
Sure.
So to your point, that is what we're thinking, is that this would
Okay.
be a vertical concrete retaining wall to provide additional flow within Fountain Creek.
Right. Right. And has any simulations been done or calculations? Would that in effect release the dance hall from any, it would raise it in effect above the creek level, the flood level, the 100-year floodplain level, or lower. Let me say that differently. It would lower the 100-year floodplain 2 feet or whatever that distance is. What is it, 2 or 3 feet? Well, 2 feet probably. Is that going to solve the problem? But it would solve the problem for the whole site.
Yeah, and that's what our goal is to,
Okay.
in
Okay.
all three of these options, the three floodway options, we are eliminating the 100-year flood from our site
Okay.
entirely. So we're just completely removing.
That's the I think it's certainly my preferred approach, and sounds like it's yours as well. So
It's definitely the design team's preferred path. You know, a big hurdle for the project is the unknowns of what a flood's going to look like and what the existing structure can or cannot withstand, even with reinforcements. Again, getting into the soil, getting into the soil around the structure, is it going to wash away? There's just a lot of there's no guarantee, I guess is what I'm saying. We can do our best analysis of the existing structure and the surrounding area and provide a design solution that that we feel confident is going to resist those loadings. But what if a 500-year flood comes? So it's just a big challenge.
have you looked at flood history and flood heights for the last 100 years?
I have not personally. I'd have to follow up with Civil on that information. But I'm
Well, I just raised that as a something that could be looked at, because the historic history over the last 100 years, from what I understand, is we've never endangered the dance hall or the previous buildings, they haven't flooded, from what I understand. Now, this is history stuff.
Yeah, and from a, and that makes complete sense from a data perspective. But unless FEMA updates their floodplain,
Right.
we would still be within the floodplain, and as design professionals, we would still have to follow the standard of care to
Sure.
promote and protect, you know, the public safety. So that's kind of where we hit the snag, which is even if it hasn't flooded, we're being told it has the potential to flood. So we have to move forward per the building code.
Understand that.
So I'm gonna let Susan talk. She's had her hand up. So Susan?
Okay,
Just, I know, Eric, you said you haven't estimated costs yet, but when you do, will you be doing a comparison of what it would cost to make the necessary improvements on the site to mitigate floodplain impacts versus what it would cost to widen the creek channels so that we can get out of the floodplain? Will there be that comparison? I'm thinking maybe city council might want that information. I don't know. What do you think?
so what we would do is we have the previous cost information about what those alternate strategies could roughly cost. So we would include that data that's already been compiled, in addition to providing what eliminating the floodplain entirely from the site would be. So we're not, you know, at this time, you know, we've been trying to work towards a best case scenario solution here, and you know, a single solution, because there's, you know, so many different paths to go down, but it's kind of up to the city as to like how much effort they want to put into exploring every nook and cranny when we have a potential solution that or we have a solution that could completely eliminate the problem from the site. So at a high level, we will include previous cost information that's been compiled, and in addition to the new cost information we're going to put together for the actual floodway improvement.
And Eric, you're using BVH's information for those costs at this point, right?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, and that's a bit of a concern because as I think you know, the last time we heard from BVH was when we got this sort of analysis about the significant problems, and they had what some thought was a very throwaway estimate of the additional costs it would take, like pretty low, $600,000 to enforce the building. And I'm not sure there was much behind that. So I would just be a little cautious about what you use from BVH on that, in that regard.
Mhm.
I agree.
It's a fair point. And we can, you know, if it's deemed that we want to provide a more robust kind of solution matrix with updated costs, that's something that we can do. It's just not something we were planning on doing. At this
Eric, can you do that by Wednesday, do you think? I don't think you can have all that information by Wednesday before.
No,
You need to upload this in council packet on Wednesday.
no, we would, I mean, we're just not at that. We're not at that level of detail where we have a fully worked out design to put costs at. We are at a level of detail that's looking at feasibility of, you know, eliminating the floodplain from the site. And that's why we're looking to have the work session with city council, is to get, you know, we can give them a rough order of magnitude cost of what the floodway improvements will look like, but we're still kind of in the middle of this process with a design that's not 100% worked through. So we can't have the level of accuracy that I know everybody is going to want.
And
Yeah, and from my standpoint, I think it's still really valuable for council to hear this presentation, because
Yeah.
this will be the first time they've ever heard that there's even an option to eliminate the floodplain. So even though you don't have hard numbers, I still think it's really important that they be given this information so they understand that there are a variety of options.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Anne, and it's good to hear that you think that'd be valuable, because I just wanted to also hit on the for the floodway improvements, we're not just talking about construction cost. In order for this solution to gain more traction, we also have to incorporate the projected costs of flood insurance or self-insuring, which you multiply that over 50 years, it's going to dwarf any cost we have tied to these floodway improvements in the short term. So the city is a long-term, I'm sure they look at things in the long term and not necessarily just the short term. So it's something that we need to incorporate into the evaluation.
Katie, do you have rough numbers of what we have in our budget at this point? For both the building and from PPRTA for the site?
I know Katie was having trouble with her audio earlier. That might be the issue right now.
Because that's one thing that we will include, and I think Eric will get that to you hopefully today, so you can just put it in there and we can address it. But it allows council to see how much money we have for the budget as we move forward for this project.
Sure.
And I think it's important for this team to know how much we have.
Yeah, and while you're pulling up those numbers, something we've talked about previously is that there is a creek walk master plan that exists, and I am not privy to its status or its history, but it seems like that there's funds that have been allocated, and it seems very possible that this could be a great project for us to show how these creek walk improvements can improve the surrounding area and really have some impact beyond just the creek itself.
Katie messaged me. She said that she is having trouble with her audio, and that she's reached out to PPRTA to confirm the exact amount we have from them. Right now, from the historic dance hall perspective, we have $871,000 allocated, and so that's just for the historic dance hall, and then some of those other improvements fall under PPRTA funds because of that potential use.
And we're verifying those numbers. I know we're working on them and hoping to have those verified by today, so we can get them to Eric to put in the presentation today or tomorrow.
Yeah.
Susan?
When is the council work session?
So that's next Tuesday. I hope that all of you will be able to be in attendance. That's next Tuesday. That's why we did this today, so that we can fine tune everything, get it ready to upload by Wednesday, and write the memo as we move.
That's on the 11th, huh?
On the 11th, yes.
Okay. And what Denise, are you, you're asking council just to say, it looks good, proceed with this path that you're on, or no, we don't like this, you just want general?
We're wanting a direction. We need, right now, we're kind of, which direction do you want us to go?
Mhm.
How do you want us to move forward? And then we can go from there, because as you know, we're kind of at this standstill until we get clear direction of what council's wanting.
And then, do you have any sense of timing? I know the task force has made a commitment to the community to do not to ask people, do you like this or don't ask or like this, but to give people information about, here's what we're recommending to go to council before it goes to council. So do you have any sense of timing? Are we talking a year? Are we talking 6 months? Do you have any sense of that at this point? It might be too soon.
I think, Susan, it will depend on what direction council gives us.
Right.
And, then Eric and his team will have to figure out how long it will take to get that all worked out. And then we would go back saying, because I don't want to go to the public again until we know that something is definite, we have the money and this is the way we're going. So I don't know what time that would take. I think it depends on the direction that council has
Okay,
to figure that out.
Mhm.
okay.
I do know that there is some focus on trying to get these restrooms built as quickly as possible. And so that's one of the things we will ask council also is, as we work on the creek or whatever direction they want us to go, do they want us to move and try to get these restrooms designed and built and ready to go? Because we do have the money for that. It is, and try to get them open before next summer, if that is possible. So that's one of the things that we'll be asking council also.
Yeah, and I guess just to add a little bit more here, that what would be perfect is if we present to council and we get clear direction as to a path that they agree is most advantageous to meet the various parameters and constraints of the project. So if we get, agreement that eliminating the 100-year floodplain seems like the best idea, then we'll be able to focus our efforts and get this initial phase wrapped up more quickly. Whereas if there is the desire to explore, all the different paths, that's going to really change how we need to move forward, because the goal kind of this effort that we've been moving down is to come up with a solution that resolves these floodplain issues. We're not looking at redesigning the property or relaying out things as much as possible. It's really how do they want us to move forward with solving for the floodplain, I guess is really what this should distill down into.
I think this is really a great approach, and we should have thought of this years ago. I think just fixing the creek issue rather than the site issue makes great sense to me. And thank you for coming up with this. I think it's great. I hope we can afford to do it.
Sure, and I think some credit needs to go to Bill as well, because I think Bill brought it up during our last meeting too.
Yeah, thanks, Bill.
Yeah.
Got it.
Well, the one thing by fixing the floodplain, which I think is important, is it doesn't just correct the building and all the issues that we may have, but it ensures the safety of cars and everything else that's there. And that's something I think as a city that we have to consider, is that aspect, because for instance, City Hall is in the floodplain, right? But we don't have cars and lots of people. We can move fairly quickly out of this place. But if you have Hiawatha, that may be different with cars parked there, people, children, etc. So by getting the floodplain corrected, it does allow safety to be the forefront.
Yeah. It's a risk assessment, right? It's what. Solving or eliminating the 100-year floodplain from the site is going to. I mean, ultimately, it's going to save the city money in the event of a flood, in flood insurance. And in a potential large expense that will come at an unknown date. So there should be, I mean, it gives peace of mind, ideally.
Any other questions? Any feedback or things that you believe we should add or that Eric should add for the presentation that we need to be prepared for?
So it sounds like we are all in agreement that the best solution is eliminating the floodplain from the property. Now we know that there's other factors that will drive the feasibility of this, like cost, but from a solution standpoint, it's the ideal scenario, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Great.
Okay, we will Eric will work his magic, put together the presentation. We'll be working on the memo and presenting next week. Next Tuesday, I hope all of you can be in attendance and be able to give feedback or give perspective if council so asks. The other thing is on the agenda, do we need to have minutes approved? I did not pull the agenda, so do we need to have minutes approved or anything else we're missing from the agenda?
Yeah, I don't think the task force has ever seen the minutes I
Okay.
did from our last meeting.
Right.
I don't
We
think they
haven't.
were ever distributed, so.
Okay, so we'll do that then and make sure that that's done. I apologize for that. So is there anything else on the agenda that we need to manage?
No, I think we walked through the presentation. We've got general consensus on the path that we're currently moving forward with. And we opened it up for general questions and comments. So if there's no more general comments and questions, I think we've completed the agenda.
Great, thanks, Eric. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time and hope to see you next Tuesday at council.
Great, thank you.
Eric,
Thank you.
Yeah, and Eric, thank you for your professionalism and your leadership as we work through this. It's much appreciated.
My pleasure. And I just do have a few quick things to confirm with you.
Okay, do you want me to give you a quick call?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay.
It's just about when I need to send information by, basically.
Okay,
Okay,
I'll
I'll talk
give you a call. Thanks, Eric.
all right, take care.
Bye.